Hello, everybody. This is Ralph Martin from RJ Quality Consulting. And in this video, I want to talk about how to conduct an ISO 17025 internal audit. So, as many of you know, I have dedicated my career to ensuring that laboratories meet the high standards of ISO IEC 17025. I am a certified auditor. I do audit laboratories to the standard. I do represent one of the largest accreditation bodies in the world. So I do know a thing or two about how to conduct an ISO 17025 audit. And the thing about the requirements under Section 8.8 of the ISO IEC 17025 audit or standard is that there is a requirement that you not only conduct internal audits in a planned manner, um, that there's also a requirement that you cover all of the clause elements of the standard itself, which is unlike some of the other ISO standards. And I have written a lot of nonconformities in this area where a laboratory will show me their internal audit reports, and it'll be something like, they took a sample, they checked to make sure everything was okay in the laboratory, and basically what I see is almost like a safety audit, that everything's okay in the laboratory. That will not pass in a ISO 17025 accreditation audit. What the auditor wants to see is that the laboratory conducted an audit to the standard. In other words, there was a checklist of some sort used. And if you've been on my website or have followed any of my videos, you know that I do offer a free ISO 17025 internal audit checklist and gap analysis tool. So in right now, if you're watching this video on YouTube, you can go to the description box and click on the link in there, and you can get my full article that I'm on my blog post right now, how to conduct an ISO 17025 internal audit. And I do go through all of the details of how to conduct an internal audit that not only is good, that it ensures that the laboratory meets all the requirements of the standard, but it will also serve as your internal audit records, which is a requirement to get accredited to ISO 17025. So if you are a laboratory that's preparing your laboratory to become accredited to ISO 17025, your accreditation body is going to want to see your internal audit records prior to them even coming out to audit your facility. So I want to make that clear that this is a requirement of the standard, and that my free internal audit checklist is a tool that you could use to provide your accreditation body for those internal audit records. So I just wanted to keep that clear. You can use this checklist for your internal audit records, and it actually is the same or similar to the checklist that the accreditation body itself would use. That being said, I want to go ahead and show you how to conduct an ISO 17025 internal audit. So, first of all, you want to understand the ISO 17025 internal audit and the whys and wherefores of why you would even conduct an internal audit. First of all, one of the main things about an internal audit is to make sure that you have all of the documentation in place to meet the requirements of the standard. What you're doing is you are comparing your quality management system of your laboratory to the requirements of the standard, and then identifying any gaps that you might have so that you can correct those gaps prior to your external audit. In addition to that, you want to ensure that you're doing this on a regular basis. At least once a year, you are covering all of the clause elements of the standard at some level. That being said, the first step of an internal audit, of course, is audit planning. So what is that? So basically, the standard requires that the laboratory have an internal audit plan. So what would meet the requirements of an internal audit plan? Well, one thing that would meet the requirements would be having an internal audit procedure. The procedure indicating how you conduct the internal audit and at what frequency. So if you had a procedure and you indicate in that procedure basically how you do your audit and that you conduct your audit once a year, something like that. That would meet the requirements of having an internal audit plan. Then you would prepare for that audit, choose your internal auditors. Oftentimes, that is the quality department or the quality manager, maybe who's is conducting the heart of the the internal audit, and then other people that you would train to your internal audit procedure or go through some sort of internal audit training that is provided by external bodies. Actually, I offer internal audit training and can give your internal auditors certificates so that it shows that they are trained to do internal audits, which is also a requirement of the standard. So basically, the audit, your internal audit, is really should be divided into two parts. I refer these two parts as a horizontal part of the audit and a vertical part of the audit. These are terms that I actually picked up from auditing FDA or food laboratories. The If you didn't know, the accreditation body that I audit for did at one time have the account for all of the FDA laboratories, the food and drug laboratories, and I have audited many of those FDA laboratories. There are actually 14 FDA laboratories in the United States, and I've audited 8 of them. Before the accreditation body lost that contract to one of their competitors due to pricing. But I have audited the FDA, and I've been audited by the FDA. So I've been on both sides of the fence with the FDA, so I'm very familiar with how they operate. That being said, one of the things that they do is in their laboratories use the term horizontal and vertical auditing. That's where I got these terms from. But the ISO 17025 um, does require that you do your audit in two parts. One is that you audit all of the clause elements of the standard at some form or another. One way, probably the best way to do that, is in sort of a tabletop fashion. In other words, you have a checklist. You're sitting at a desk. You have all of the paperwork in front of you, and you go through the checklist, which is clause by clause, and then you see if you meet the requirements for each of those clauses, kind of like I said, in a tabletop fashion. The other part of the audit is known as a vertical audit. What that is you pick us, you have so many methods that as a laboratory. Like for example, if you're a testing laboratory, that means you have a number of tests that you want to be accredited for or are in the scope of your accreditation. Those are the number of test methods that you perform. If you're a calibration laboratory, those are the number of calibrations that you perform. Um, so you could have 4 test methods, you could have 3 test methods, whatever it is, you want to follow a sample for each of your test methods and audit to the technical requirements of the standard. And I'll get to what those are as far as which clause elements represent the technical requirements. So again, you have 2 sections of the audit or 2 parts of your audit: a horizontal audit, which is a tabletop audit that covers all of the clause elements of the standard. Then you have a vertical audit where you follow a sample for each of your tests and you audit the technical requirements of the standard, which are essentially sections 6 and 7 of the standard. The horizontal audit it incorporates sections 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, all of the clause elements at one time in a tabletop manner. That being said, so how do you do that, right? How do you conduct a horizontal and vertical audit? So first of all, the key areas to be addressed in the horizontal audit are really kind of 3 things that I'm talking holistically. So ISO in general, whether it be ISO 17025, ISO 9001, ISO 13485, the International Organization of Standards is all about this sentence. Say what you do what you say, right? That is what ISO is all about. We want proof that you you do what you say you do. So there really is 3 elements to this. Say what you do, Second, do what you say you do. Third, show evidence that you actually have done what you say you do. I know this sounds weird, but I think once you get what I'm talking about, you'll see how it pertains to conducting the horizontal audit of the ISO 17025 standard. It is highly recommended that the laboratory take the necessary time that at least once a year that you go through every clause element of the standard. Not only is it a requirement for your internal audit, but it is the right thing to do, and it helps the laboratory understand not only the standard, but how your laboratory's management system actually meets the requirements of the standard. If you want to follow this blog post and really learn how to conduct an internal audit, go ahead and click the link in this article, download my free internal audit checklist, or you can fill out the form here. Either way, you can just download this checklist and you'll see you can follow along this video and read this article and understand exactly how this would benefit the lab. Not only to complete your internal audit records because that's required. That is also a good gap analysis tool if you're not ready for an internal audit, you don't feel like you have the procedures and everything necessary in order to even have an audit. It's good to go in that case use my tool as a gap analysis to find out which procedures you don't have, and kind of go from there. And if you don't have any procedures, I'll go through with how you deal with that as well. So first of all, download my free internal audit checklist. Uh, I could do that for you, but I have some images that I could show you of what I mean by this. So it is recommended that you identify the associated laboratory documents for each of these three items that I just mentioned. The three types of documents that you would want to be auditing are number one, your upper level documents. Your upper level documents are really typically housed in a quality manual. Although a quality manual is not a requirement technically of the ISO 17025 standard any longer, it was in the 2005 version of the standard. When the standard was revised in 2017 to the current version, there is no longer a requirement for a quality manual. But should you have one? Yes, you should definitely have one. It is a good place to house required procedures and policies that are required. And the quality manual is a good source to have for a housing for these policies and procedures. Um, Also, it's good for internal audit purposes that you have a quality manual that is aligned to the same clause element structure of the standard. In other words, Section 4.1 of the standard deals with impartiality. Therefore, Section 4.1 of your quality manual should deal with impartiality. You should do your quality manual in alignment with the same clause structure. That being said, your first type of document that you're auditing is your upper level document. That is typically the section of your quality manual that talks about that particular clause element. This is the say what you do part, right? I said, you know, do what you say what you do. So when you say, like for example, with section 4.1 of impartiality, the standard requires the laboratory shall be structured to safeguard impartiality. The quality manual under section 4.1 might say something like company XYZ is structured to safeguard impartiality in the following ways, and its policy is blah, 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 right? That would be an example of say what you do. We meet section 4.1 by this, and it's stated in your quality manual. That is the upper level document I'm referring to. The second level of document is what I refer to as the lower level document. That describes how you meet this requirement. In the case of impartiality, it would be the impartiality policy itself. Document number XYZ, company ABC's impartiality policy, and it's the actual document that states the policy. And then the objective evidence is the third type of document, and that's the record. That might be the impartiality policy that's signed by each employee. That's a record that shows that your employees have agreed with your impartiality policy. I'm just using impartiality as an example. The idea is that you do this for every clause element of the standard. And I know that sounds like a big undertaking, but you really think about it, you would only really do this one time, right? I know that you should have an internal audit once a year. However, if you go through this checklist and you go through what I refer to as column 3, and you do that at least one time, that will be a list of all your 3 types of documents, and they typically don't change. Unless you're like rewriting your procedures and assigning new document numbers to them, or you've like completely rewrite your quality manual, you probably won't change these documents from year to year. What you will change is the current record. Like, for example, in section 6.5, where it talks about calibration records, your calibration records for 2020 aren't going to be current in 2025. So your that 2025's internal audit, you'll gather the 2025 calibration records, not the 2020 calibration records. But your section of your quality manual and your procedure will remain the same. And the fact that you might have a equipment log, that number and document might be the same, although you might have different revision history of the equipment or whatever, but the document itself probably isn't going to change. You might change the rev number, but for this purpose, you probably wouldn't put the rev number on your checklist anyway. So that being said, what you would want to do, and I have an example here of section 6.4.3 of the standard. And this is an example of what you would, this is what my checklist would look like, by the way, except I would have every single clause element of the standard. It is it's a 50-page checklist. And you're thinking, wow, that's an undertaking. But the idea is that if you did this one time, that means you have a good whoever does this, whatever quality manager or analyst or whoever actually does this work and fills out column 3, they do that one time, and I guarantee you they're going to understand what policies and procedures meet which clause element of the standard. Not only will they learn the standard really well, but they're also going to know how your management system meets the requirement of the standard really well. So that is very important, especially if you're trying to train, let's say your quality manager quits and you want to train a new one. The best thing to do is have them go through this uh, task of completing this document and understanding which section of the quality manual meets the requirements of that clause element in the standard, what procedure is the how-to part, and what records are the evidence that you've completed that. So I'll back up to now that I've explained that, I'll go back over the 3 items again. First is the section of your quality manual describing how you meet that clause element. Second is the procedure itself, which describes how you do a particular thing, which would be a procedure. So, for example, I have an example here for section 6.4.3, which the standard says the laboratory shall have a procedure for the handling, transport, storage, use, and planned maintenance of equipment in order to ensure proper functioning and to prevent contamination or deterioration. And you'll notice I put on my checklist, objective evidence is required. So the 3 elements would be section 6.4.3 of the quality manual says you do have a procedure for, because the standard says you shall have a procedure for. So the first high-level document is section 6.4.3 of your standard says, company XYZ has procedure blah, blah, blah to meet the requirements of requiring a procedure for the handling, transport, and maintenance of equipment. Do you see what I mean? That is the high-level document that says you meet this requirement. The second document is the procedure that says how you meet the handling, transport, storage, use, and planned maintenance of equipment in order to ensure proper maintenance of the equipment. Okay, that is the how you do this part. That is a procedure. That would be the procedure itself. Now, what's the third document? Well, it's an equipment log, maybe a master equipment list that shows all of your equipment, when it was last maintained and when it's due to be maintained again. For measuring equipment, it might be the name of the piece of equipment, when it was last calibrated, when it's going to be calibrated, and you have the ID numbers of the actual balance or pipette or whatever it is on an equipment log. That would be your record. That is the objective evidence, which is number three, objective evidence showing you meet this requirement. This is the evidence that you've actually performed what you say you do. So the idea is that you do this exercise for every single clause element of the standard. You say, you say what you say how you do what you say you do, and then you have the objective evidence that proves you actually did what you say you do. You do that one time through every clause element of the standard, and then every year you would just check to make sure, for example, in this case, that your equipment log is up to date, that your procedure is readily available, and that you still have the section in the quality manual. Or maybe when you go through this exercise, you find out you don't have a procedure for this, or you don't have a section in your quality manual, or you don't have an equipment log. That would be identified as a gap. You would put NC in the fourth column, and in the fifth column, you would write yourself a nonconformance, and the corrective action would be to fill whatever that gap is. So this checklist can be used as either a internal audit record, or it could be used as a gap analysis tool, depending on how mature your quality management system is. I hope that makes sense, because if you are a laboratory that you actually don't have these procedures, or you're just not at the place where, hey, I don't think I can even do a gap analysis because every single one of these is going to be a nonconformance. If that is the case, I recommend that you identify all of the required procedures and policies of the standard and you write them. Or if you want a shortcut, I do offer a complete quality manual that's already written. You just put your company name in it. Excuse me, I have a little cold. Um, and I also have, as an upgraded feature, all of the required procedures of the standard. There's about 12 of those. So you can get the complete quality manual, which is about a 55-page document that has all the required clause elements of the whole standard for $49. And then you can get, as an upgrade, for another $49, all of the required procedures. And I have a link in the bottom of this video if you'd like to check that out. But going on, so that's the horizontal part of the audit. The and this would meet, if you fill this whole document out and you've identified your gaps, put your gaps in like a table format, that would serve as your internal audit record. The next step you want to do is what is known as a vertical audit. And the vertical audit, what that is you take each test method. Let's say you have heavy metals, pH, specific gravity. Those are three test methods that you have that you want to be accredited for, or that you're already accredited for, or depending on what stage of the accreditation process that you fall into. And what you do is you take a sample that you've already analyzed, and you go through the technical requirements of that sample. So you might ask yourself, well, Ralph, what are the technical requirements? The technical requirements are sections 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, 7.5, 7.6, 7.7, and 7.8. These are known as the technical requirements of ISO IEC 17025-2017. I do have a blog article about the technical requirements, what they are, and you can read about that on my blog as well. I have a link to that, but um, for a real quick reference, I do have a table that can also be used as a internal audit checklist for a vertical audit. And what you would do is you would have a sheet like this, or a table, or you can put it into a Word format, an Excel format, whatever format works best for you. It could be a piece of paper. But basically, you would take a sample from one of your test methods for each one, and you would go through each of the technical elements on one sheet of paper. It's a lot shorter than the 50-page checklist. This is one page. You would section 6.2 is personnel. That's your training section. Your objective evidence for that particular sample that you're following would be, okay, who ran the sample, and do I have a copy of their training records? So you look for the training records, job descriptions, everything that meets the requirements of section 6.2 in the standard. And if you don't know what those are, reference the standard, go right to section 6.2 and see what the requirements are, and then collect those documents that pertain to that sample, the analyst that ran that sample for that test method. And if you are missing something, you write NC. If you have everything, you would write C. C for compliant and C for non-compliant. You would do that for section 6.2 personnel, section 6.3, which is facilities and environmental conditions. You would be looking at environmental condition logs, like a temperature, humidity log, because the standard section 6.3 requires that the laboratory monitors, records environmental conditions in accordance with relevant specifications. So that means you probably have some sort of log where you maybe record temperature, humidity, or whatever environmental conditions are associated with that particular test method. And then you would, if you have any, uh, let's say you had a log, and you were outside of one of the parameters, but you didn't write a non-conformance. Well, that is breaking that clause element of the standard. You'd write yourself an NC. Or everything is okay, you write C. And then you go to equipment. You look at all of your equipment. You make sure that all your equipment is properly labeled. If you find a balance that doesn't have a calibration label, well, you know you didn't meet the requirements of section 6.4.8, which specifically says all equipment requiring calibration shall be labeled, coded, or otherwise identified to allow the user to identify its calibration status. That is a requirement under section 6.4.8, right? That would be part of this checklist. You find that oops, I had a balance. Oh, there was no label on it. Okay, NC, right? And then you would write which balance had an NC, and then that lets you know that you need to correct that before you get the real auditor, the external auditor that comes in and finds the same thing, because if you find it before he does, they're going to correct that before he finds it. Therefore, you just saved yourself from getting a nonconformance from an external auditor who's going to be using the same checklist. Keep in mind, I'm an auditor. I'm letting you know how to audit like an auditor would, so that you can be ready for an external audit, right? That's the whole point of doing an internal audit, is to get your laboratory ready for the external audit. And the better your internal audit is, the more nonconformances you identify and correct, the fewer nonconformances you'll get in an external audit. That's the whole point, right? So anyway, you would do that for all of the sections: 6.5, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, 7.5, 7.6, 7.7, and 7.8, which is the final test report. And to understand those, just go to those sections of the standard to see what those requirements actually are, and take every test method, follow a sample, and fill out one of these forms. So when you're done with the audit, what you'll have, because as you go through this article, you'll find that you want to identify gaps. So every time you get an NC on either the internal audit checklist or this horizontal checklist, You would identify it as nonconformity, right? And then you would uh, notate all of those nonconformities in some sort of table or nonconformance record, something like that. And then that would be you would put a summary table within your checklist. What I typically do is I take my long checklist, this one, and I go all the way to the end of the checklist and I create a table. And I put NC 1, 2, 3, 4, however NCs, the section of the standard that I got the NC in, and maybe like comment section and detail what the nonconformance is, and then maybe a due date for getting that nonconformity corrected. That would be part of your internal audit records. And this is something that an auditor is going to want to see. So that's how that works. And then you can finish this blog post. I go through the checklist. How do I identify nonconformities? What to document? Escalating your nonconformities to a corrective action record, correcting your corrective actions, making sure that you shore up or correct all your nonconformities uh, before the management review, because your management review, one of the required inputs is your internal audit results, right? So you have to do this before you have a management review. That there's some confusion there. Oftentimes, I'll look at management review records and the laboratory will say, yeah, we haven't done an internal audit yet. Like, well, you're supposed to do that before you have the management review because your internal audit results are supposed to be discussed in management review. So are your corrective actions. So if you have an internal audit, you identify nonconformities, you document your corrective actions. Now you have 3 or 4 of the required elements for management review. So that's sort of how the management system process works, a part of it. There's more, and I have more articles that you could read about that kind of stuff. Then maintaining and finalizing your internal audit records. So what are your audit records? So basically your records are going to be that checklist filled out, the horizontal checklist, then the vertical audit checklist filled out, the a summary of your findings, your nonconformities, and your opportunities for improvement, and that's your records. Those documents, those 3 documents. So you would have a horizontal checklist filled out, you'd have a vertical audit checklist filled out, and then you'd have a summary of your findings, which are a list of your nonconformities. And that's your internal audit records. You can close your records and leave your corrective actions open. And then once you correct all your nonconformities, then you would close those your corrective action records. Those are separate records than your internal audit. Those they could You don't have to wait until those corrective actions are corrected before you close your internal audit records. So I want to make that clear because you still need your internal audit records, whether you've corrected all of the problems or not. You still have your summary of findings on your internal audit report. That's separate from your individual corrective actions that might go onto a corrective action log. Separate record. Those are your corrective action records. These are your internal audit records. And then you're going to have complaint records. Those are all separate records. And those are, you could read about record uh, control in section 7.5 for technical records, and then section 8.3 for uh, just control of records that discusses this. And then so I have some frequently asked questions and then next steps and additional resources. So go ahead and read this full article, download my free checklist, and also check out my package for the quality manual and procedures. So just real quick, let me kind of show you what some of these look like. Um, I'll go to, oops. Actually, what I'll do is go ahead and let me go to RJ. There we go. So real quick, let me show you what my quality manual looks like. So I have all of the corresponding procedures as well. But underneath the this video in the blog post and also within the video description of the video, I'll have a link where you can check out my quality manual and the associated procedures. But here's the quality manual. You would just put your laboratory name right here, and then you could put your company logo. So if you have like a company logo, you could put that there. This is document number, so you're keeping your control of documents intact, revision number, date, that is effective date, maybe the approved by the laboratory director and then the quality manager. That's for document control purposes. This is the table of contents, so I cover all of the clause elements of the standard. We have scope, normative references, terms and conditions, general requirements. Section 4.1, here's impartiality. Laboratory name ensures that all laboratory activities, including testing and calibration, are conducted impartially. The laboratory's management system is structured and managed. And so it's similar to the standard, except for rather than the shall statements that you should or shall do something, this says that we do it. Our management is committed to impartiality. And then what it also does is it references that impartiality policy that employees sign. So here you see anything that's italicized bold is an actual policy that it references. And then we go into the first required procedure, which shows up in section 6.2. I won't go through the whole thing, but I just want to show you how there's 12 required procedures in the standard, where literally the standard says the laboratory shall have a procedure for dot dot dot, and that procedure shall include A through H. There's about 12 of those requirements within the standard. 6.2 is one of them, where the standard says a laboratory shall have a personnel procedure, and that procedure shall include. Here, I say the laboratory has a documented personnel competence and training procedure. You see that's bold, italicized. That means there's a procedure for that, and it includes all these requirements. I do that for every one of the 12 to 15 procedures. I have procedures that are required, and I have procedures that are not necessarily required, but are nice to have, and they meet requirements of some of the required policies within the standard. But what's really cool is there's about 50 pages of this. You go all the way down to the first appendix, and the appendix shows it's like a master document list. So it shows Appendix A, list of reference documents and procedures. Everywhere where I pointed to the procedure, impartiality agreement, confidentiality policy for employees, these are the actual required policies and procedures of the ISO 17025 standard in their appropriate required element of the standard. And like I said, there are about 15 of these. And then so if you buy this quality manual, you'll get all of this and you'll know what required procedures you need to write, and you can use the standard to write the procedures. Or what you could do is take the upgrade for another $49, and you can actually buy every single one of these procedures. You get all of the required procedures, all of the required policies, along with the appropriate forms that are associated with that procedure, all for $98. That includes the quality manual, all the required procedures, all the required policies, and all the required forms associated with all those policies and procedures. You'll have everything you need for documentation to fill into that checklist that meets column 3 that I showed you on my internal audit checklist, out of the box. All you have to do is put your laboratory's name and certain, like your organizational chart, things like that. Very easy to do. Takes about 20 minutes for all of these procedures and policies. I'll give you a example of what one of the procedures would look like. I'm pulling out this just happens to be non-conforming work procedure. And as it's opening, it's taking a long time to open. Here it is. So here's a non-conforming work procedure. Um, Let me go up to the top. Uh, Wait a minute. Here we go. Non-conforming work procedure. You just, put in your effective date, purpose, scope, references. This is the responsibility, quality managers. Here's the procedure. This procedure has all the required elements of section 6.2 or section 7.10, non-conforming work. And then in the appendices, it has the non-conforming work register, which is a log, a non-conforming work log, a non-conforming work form, and it tells you how to fill it out. It's not the prettiest form in the world, but it does meet all the requirement. You can change it up, put it into your own type of form, or you could use it right out of the box. There's a root cause section and then a revision history. And that is, I do this for every single one of the required policies and procedures. So basically, for $98, you get all the required documentation that meets the requirements of ISO 17025 written from a certified auditor. This is Ralph Martin signing off. You make it a great day.